Have you ever wondered where certain thoughts come from, especially those thoughts that seem to steal your peace? The answer is that many of these patterns, fear, anger, anxiety, are not originally yours. Think of your mind as an antenna tuned into thought forms that already exist in the collective. Seeing this dynamic changes the way you deal with suffering. The struggle to control the mind gives way to a calm that comes from observation. The question almost everyone asks at some point is, where do these thoughts come from? Not the ordinary thoughts about lunch or a task, but those specific thoughts that seem to have a life of their own. They impose themselves on you uninvited, like intruders who refuse to leave. That sudden burst of jealousy, the wave of fear before a decision, or the anger over something small. Why, despite their destructive nature, do they feel so deeply and intimately like yours? Your natural tendency is to become a detective of your own psyche. You look for clues in the past. Was it my childhood? A trauma? A flaw in my character? This search for the why feels logical, but it is often a trap. Have you ever had a thought so strange or negative that you wondered, is this really me? What was that thought? Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel and don't forget to like this video. It would really help the channel a lot. The parable of the poisoned arrow. There is an old parable from the Buddha about a man in the forest who was hit by a poisoned arrow. The pain was sharp and the danger was immediate. His friends wanted to remove the arrow and apply the antidote, but the man stopped them. He demanded answers first. Who shot the arrow? Was it a man or a woman? What caste were they from? What wood was the arrow made of? Which bird provided the feathers? While the man lost himself in his investigation, the poison spread. He would die before receiving the first answer. His need to understand the suffering prevented him from taking the only action that mattered, removing the arrow. This arrow is your suffering, the jealous thought, the paralyzing anxiety. Like the wounded man, we often refuse to simply deal with the pain the moment it appears. We ask, why am I feeling this? Who is to blame? When you feel mentally unwell, are you someone who immediately tries to remove the arrow? Or do you often get stuck in the question of why this is happening to you? The trap of the analytical mind. While you analyze and theorize, the arrow remains in your flesh, and the poison of rumination and self-pity spreads. The analytical mind loves to solve problems and will keep the problem alive to have a purpose. The original teaching was a call to radical practicality. Stop the bleeding. Remove the cause of the pain. The analysis can wait. First, you remove the arrow. But now that we've set that priority, we can look at the mechanics behind the arrow. Why is this arrow, in most cases, never yours in the first place? The core assumption that causes suffering is the idea that your mind is an isolated entity in your skull. You believe you are the author of every thought and emotion. Can you remember a moment when you were so absorbed in analyzing a problem that the problem itself only became larger and heavier? The collective human mind. Consider another possibility, that there is such a thing as a collective human mind, a shared field of consciousness built up over thousands of years. Every fear, joy, act of cruelty, or compassion has left an energetic imprint. In this ocean of thoughts, there are recurring patterns we can call thought forms. Thought forms of victimhood, anger, or jealousy belong to no one in particular. They are impersonal, energetic structures that want to survive by expressing themselves through an individual mind tuned to their frequency. How does the idea feel to you that your mind might be more of a receiver of collective thoughts than a transmitter of your own unique thoughts? Resonance and the psychic clouds. Imagine these thought forms as clouds in the atmosphere. There are dark clouds of sadness and storm clouds of anger. They are just there. They are not your clouds. But what happens when such a cloud discharges its storm within you? This happens through resonance. A small event, a hurtful word, a failed plan, creates a spark of emotion in you. This small emotion vibrates at a certain frequency and, like a magnet, attracts the much larger collective field vibrating at the same tone. Your personal sadness attracts the massive collective thought form of sadness. Suddenly, a small disappointment becomes a deep sense of hopelessness. You've opened the door, and the thought form creates a convincing story to justify its presence. I am your anger because of what happened. Have you ever noticed a small irritation suddenly exploding into a massive anger that was no longer in proportion to the situation? Do you recognize the collective cloud in that now? The depersonalization of pain. When you realize your mind is a channel, guilt begins to disappear. The struggle to fix yourself loses its meaning. But this raises a question. Are the intense emotions in your body also not personal? This is the most liberating idea, the depersonalization of emotional pain. The illusion lies in the word my. As soon as you say my sadness or my anger, you claim ownership. You weave it into your identity. The energy of anger is a universal phenomenon, a force of nature without a name or story. It only becomes personal through the story your mind attaches to it. I am angry at that person because the energy is collective. The story is individual. The invitation is not to deny the pain, but to question its authorship. What would change in your life if you started saying, there is sadness instead of, I am sad? Possession by the mind. When you fully identify with a thought form, a kind of possession occurs, not like in movies, but subtle. A collective thought form takes control of your mental field. At that moment, you are no longer using your mind as an instrument. The thought form is using you as a vehicle to feed on energy. We've all experienced this. You lose your temper in an argument and say things you don't mean. Hours later, you think, that wasn't me. And that's true. That was the thought form of anger taking the wheel while the real driver was asleep. For most people, this is the normal waking state. They unconditionally believe they are the voice in their head. Can you describe a moment when you thought afterward, I wasn't myself? Who or what was speaking at that moment? The ego's reaction, the mind, or the ego structure will do anything to protect this possession. As soon as you try to observe without identifying, the ego reacts fiercely. It throws more thoughts, justifications, and painful memories at you to convince you that your anger is justified. It says, don't look at the anger, look at what they did. This defensive reaction occurs because the identity based on thoughts feels threatened by awareness. Without my story of suffering, the ego feels as if it ceases to exist. And in a sense, it does. The struggle is not with a personal enemy, but with an impersonal pattern that wants to survive. Do you notice your mind resisting when you try to simply be an observer? What arguments does your mind use to pull you back into the drama? Collective consequences and conclusion. This dynamic also works on a massive scale. When a thought form becomes strong enough, It spreads like a mental virus. History is full of examples of collective insanity, where entire populations became possessed by destructive ideologies based on fear and hate. But it's also in everyday things, like the cultural belief that happiness is found in constant consumption. The path to peace is not fighting thoughts, but recognizing their source. Once you see that the clouds are not the sky, and that the thoughts are not you, the storm loses its power. You become the observer, the space in which everything appears. And in that space, you find the peace that was always there. What is the most important lesson you take from this video for your daily life? How will you handle an intruder in your head next time? Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel.